Hey there. In this screencast, I am going to sort of step through the process of creating a basic layout like what we're looking at here. Sort of a contained page with a header, menu, content area that's got two columns, and then a footer. So this is a pretty standard layout. Obviously, there are many different types of layouts, lots of different styles and designs out there, but I'll just step through this really basic one. Okay, so what we're starting with here is what I have over here is here's the HTML. I have everything contained in a wrapper div, a wrapper block or box, and then I have my header. I'm using the header structural element, one of those HTML5 elements that I've mentioned. The navigation is in its own block using the nav tag, and then I have my content contained inside the main tag. Each section within that is contained in its own wrapper. So I'm using the aside, which is typically used for like a sidebar content type of content, and then article, which would be like your main content, and then the footer tag. And again, all of this, so I basically have 4 sections, and then of course this one has some subsections. All of that is contained inside of my wrapper div. So this is what it looks like without any CSS. Well, I guess I do have some CSS. I have the body tag has a background of silver, which is why everything looks a little faded. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do, so if we look at what we're going for, and again, just a reminder, most of the time when you're coding a web page, you're starting with a design. You've either designed it or you've been given a design, or at least a design direction from a designer. So for the sake of this example, let's pretend like that's what we're looking at. So this is what we want the website to look like. So when looking at this, when looking at what we want it to look like, what I usually do is I try to think of it in terms of what are the boxes. And I would be easiest if I could actually do this on the whiteboard, because what I literally do sometimes is I'll print it out, or like I'll take it in Photoshop and I'll just literally draw boxes around each of the things that needs to be in its own container. So the first thing I see when looking at this is that everything is contained inside of this white box. So I know I need to start with a main root element or a main wrapper container div, and then everything will go inside of that. And then I can see that my header is its own thing, so that should be in its own container. The navigation is its own thing. I'm going to skip the main content, and then the footer is its own thing. So those are pretty straightforward. But then in looking at this main content, so like the third column down, the third row down, you can see that I have some content here, some content here. So I know each of those needs to be contained in its own box or its own div. But both of them are contained by that border. So that lets me know that both of those need to be contained inside another div. And then of course, all of this stuff is contained in the outer div or the main wrapper div. Okay, so I've sort of deconstructed this design, or this layout, the one that I'm shooting for. I've deconstructed that to then write my HTML. So everything is in a main wrapper div, got my header, got my nav. Remember, best practice, standard practice, you don't have to, but it's sort of recommended to create your menus as lists. So that's what I've done here. I have an unordered list. Each menu item is its own list item. And then my main content, again, 2 blocks within the main one so that I can target that with the black border, and then I can target each of these separately to make them sit next to each other, and then my footer. Okay, so that's our starting point. So we were given this design in the pretend world. We were given this design, I deconstructed, figured out what needs to be its own box, what's nested in other boxes, create the HTML accordingly. Now we have to write the CSS to target each of those HTML elements and make it look how we want it to look. So I'm going to go ahead. I don't always do this, but in a lot of cases it makes sense to sort of start big and then work your way in. Meaning I'm going to start with the wrapper div and create. I know that everything needs to go in a box that has a white background and a black border. And of course we can see that this box is doesn't take up 100% of the browser. I'm going to estimate that at like 80 or 90% or something like that. Okay, so again, this is my starting point with no CSS. I'm going to target the wrapper div. It's an ID, so I do hashtag ID name, and I'll start with the background. I don't have my live preview on, so I have to go back and forth and save and refresh. Okay, so that's a starting point. I'll go ahead and add that border. I'll just assume it was a little bit thicker, so I'll make it 2 pixels wide. Black, and I'm also going to set the width to 80%. Whoops, I hit save on the wrong thing, or refresh rather. Refresh. Okay, so getting a little closer. Obviously, I've got the white background, I've got the outline, the black outline, or the border. We can see that in my final example, there's more space between all of the content and the edge of the container div. So I'm going to add a little padding, and I'm just going to estimate this. Again, web design coding is a very iterative process. You're going to try a value, save, refresh, see what it looks like, and maybe do that a few times until you're happy with it. And in some cases, you might actually have to pull something into Photoshop, use the little ruler and see exactly what the width or the height is. But I'm just going to estimate for the sake of this example. Okay, so I've got my wrapper div looking pretty good. You can see that it's not centered. I'm gonna come back to that at the end of this screencast to talk about how to center a block within its container. Okay, so I'm just gonna go on down the list, or rather, so I'm starting out, going in. That meant I started with the wrapper div. Now I'm gonna go in, which means I'm gonna do each of my blocks, starting with the top one. So I am going to target my header, and what do I need to do here? I know that I need to center the text, and there's probably some padding or margin. I might come back to that, so let's just start by centering the text. Oops. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to jump to the menu now. So basically, I need to take my list, which of course shows each list item as a block level element. I need to convert that to a horizontal menu. I have two ways, well, from what we know now, there are two ways to do that. One is I can use the display property to basically convert each list item from a block level element to an inline so that they sit next to each other, or I can use float. I'm going to go ahead and use the first one because I'm going to use float for the main content. So I want to have both examples in this. Okay, so I'm going to use the display method. So what I have to do is I have to target these LIs, use display to tell them to display as inline elements instead of block level. So I'm going to use, it's always good to use some contextual selectors. I don't have another list in this, whoops, my alarm's going off. I don't have another list in this document, but theoretically I could. So I want to specifically say target the list items within the nav element. Or, of course, I could give this an ID, like main menu, spell it right, something like that, target that, and then there's no question. It would, whatever styles I'm writing would only apply to that specific thing. I'm just going to use a contextual selector here. And I'm just going to start with the first thing. I'm going to tell the list items within the nav element to display as inline. So let's go back to my working version here. So it does two things. Makes them each list item sit side by side because they're displaying as inline elements, and it also automatically gets rid of the bullets. Obviously, I need to add in some spacing. I need to add in these little borders. So let me just sort of estimate here. Probably, I'm going to use the padding shortcut. Remember, with any of these shortcuts, padding, margin, border, you can put one value here, and it will apply that to all four sides. You can put, let's do 10 pixels. Two values. The first one applies to top and bottom, second one applies to right and left. Or you can put all four values in there if you want. And of course you can say specifically padding top, padding bottom, padding right, padding left. I'm going to use the shortcut, and I'm going to say, just set the top and bottom to nothing, to 0. You'll notice that when you say 0, you don't actually have to put the pixels in there. That's just another little shortcut. You can, that's fine. I'm just kind of in the habit of not. And then 10 pixels, right and left. Let's see. That looks pretty good. And we can see though that when I pull up the inspector, my UL, my unordered list, has some padding there on the left, and that's just the default behavior for all lists. But when we look at what I'm going for, there's no margin here. I want my menu to sit all the way over on the left. So that means I have to get rid of that default behavior. So what I'm going to do, and again, that is not on the list item, it's on the main container, which would be the UL, the unordered list. So I'm going to go back over here, and instead of targeting the list item, I'm going to target its parent, the UL, and get rid of, I could just say padding 0 just to be safe and have it get rid of set 0 on all four sides, or I can again be specific and say on the left side I want 0 padding. So that's pretty good. Last thing here with the menu is I need to add these little borders. You can see that it's showing on each list item on the right of the text. So I'm going to go back to target the list items, border only right, solid black. So getting closer. Obviously there's more padding and margin between the header in the final design and the menu. Again, I'm just going to ignore that for now. That's the kind of thing where you're going to do a lot of back and forth to play around with different values and see what looks best. Let's see. Okay, so my next thing I'm going to target here is the main content, which is actually all of this. I need to do a couple things. I need to contain all of that in a box that has a black border. I then need to target the sidebar and the content and make them sit side by side. And I need to target either the sidebar or the main content and give it a side border. So if I'm targeting the sidebar, it would be border right. If I'm targeting the main content, it would be border left. Okay, so let's start with the main thing, which is targeting all of that content. So the containing element, the thing that contains all of this content. So that is going to be this main tag here. I'm going to target that and give it a border. Obviously, I'm just reusing a lot of the same styles here. 1 pixel width, solid border style black. So I've now contained all of my content. Obviously, you know, we can see everything is smushed up against the edge, smushed up against the border. So we're going to need to add a little padding. So again, padding is the space between the border and the content. In this case, the content is all of this, everything contained in the aside element, everything contained in the article element. I'm just going to do like padding 20 pixels. So that's pretty good. Getting closer. Now for the 2-column thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to target the aside within the main element and the article within the main element, and I'm going to float them next to each other. So I'm going to say within main there is a tag called aside. Also within main there's another element called article. Make sure to spell it right. I'm going to use a grouped selector here because I actually want to apply the same float property to both those things. So I don't have to do it this way. I can write them on separate lines, totally fine. But sometimes you can be a little more efficient by grouping selectors that share the same styles. Okay, so if you would watch my float screencast, this should look familiar. A couple things have happened here. So one, float did seem to work. These two things are sitting next to each other. So that's pretty good. But my container, the thing that had the border around it, has collapsed, basically. And remember, that's what happens when you float elements. What happens is the containing element no longer is able to assess the full height of the things that it's containing. The floating throws it off, and it's like, well, I don't know how tall your content is. I'm just going to make myself as tall as I need to be based on my own padding and margin, basically. So to deal with that, whenever this collapsing happens, all you need to do to fix it is target that container. And so in this case, the container is the main tag or the main element. And I'm going to give it an overflow property with the value of auto. So this is the overflow auto trick. Save, refresh, and now magically the container element is like, oh, okay, now I understand. Now I understand how tall each of you is, and therefore this is how tall I need to be. The other thing that happened there, which has been fixed with the overflow, is that the footer was also floating. So even though it looks fixed now, what I usually do is whenever I have anything floating, as soon as I have something later in my document that should not be floated, that should literally just, start fresh on its own new line, even if it looks okay, just for good measure, I will target it. So what I'm targeting here is this footer element. I'll target it and use the clear property. I'm going to set the value to both. So if there was a left float or if there was a right float, clear both of them. So this shouldn't look any different here. But that just makes sure that all previous floating has been nulled, basically. Doesn't mean you can't do floats later, but you're just saying at this point, I don't need those floats. I'm just starting fresh. Okay, so we're almost there. Just a couple things. We need to clean up each of these content boxes, add a little padding, set a width. You can see the sidebar only takes up about a quarter or a third or so of the container, and add that border. So I am going to, let's see, target the sidebar, which I have in the aside element. I'm going to give it a width of 25%. And let's see. And then I think with the article, so with the one on the right, I'm not going to set the width. I'm just going to assume that it'll take up what's remaining. So I want to restrict the sidebar to 25% of what's available, and then the article or the main content can take up the rest. So with the article, I'm going to add a little padding, and I'm going to set the border on the one on the right, which means I'm going to say border left. One pixel, solid black. So we're pretty good. I guess, oh yeah, okay, so this is showing down a little bit because I added some padding. I can just add the same padding to the sidebar if I want. So now they're on the same horizontal line. And you can see here that like the values I've given to my padding is not exactly matching up with the original design, but close enough for this example. And again, that's something that you'll have to do a lot of back and forth, a lot of experimentation with. Let's see, one last thing here with the footer. In my working example, it is of course defaulting to text-align left. In my design, we can see that it's over on the right, and of course there's a little padding. So I'm going to target that footer that I've already put in here, add some more padding. I just keep defaulting to 20 pixels. You can play around with that. And then text align right. So pretty close. Again, might need to add a little more padding up here, maybe a little less padding in here, but these are pretty close. Okay, so the last thing here that I want to go through, and this can be a little confusing, but you can see that my wrapper div, the white background box, is not centered. In my working example and the design I'm trying to emulate, it is centered. So one would think that to center that, I would target that box, so that would be the wrapper, and do text align center. Let's go ahead and do that. That doesn't move the box, as you can see, but it does center all of the text inside of it. So that's not exactly what I want. I don't want my text centered. So text align, as the name implies, centers text content, also images, by the way, centers text content within a box. And in this case, it trickles down, so all of the children elements inherit the properties of its parent unless something's been overridden. So it just sort of trickles down. So anything contained in this, unless it's been told otherwise, is going to have text that is aligned to the center. So again, that's not what I'm going for here. I want to take that whole box and move it to the center of the browser window. So to do that, this is not that intuitive, but what we need to do is basically set the right and left margins of that box. So again, I'm talking about that main wrapper box, the one with the white background and the black border, the thing that contains everything else. I'm going to target that, and I'm going to set the right and left margins. So that would be the space on the outside of the border. So this is the right margin. Of course, this is the border. This is the right padding. we're going to target the right and left and set it to a value called auto. So I'm not going to give it a specific number. I'm basically telling, and it's important to target both of them. When you set it to auto, you're basically telling the browser to auto set the right and left margin so that they're equal. When they're equal, that automatically centers the box. So I'm going to do margin left, auto, margin right, auto. And again, this only works if you target both left and right and set them to auto. So now my box has been centered. So again, the lesson here is text align is only going to center text content and image content within a box. To center the entire box within its container, in this case I want to center this entire wrapper div within its container, which is the browser window. To center the whole box within its container, you target that box, set its right and left margin to auto, which tells the browser to set both of them to whatever value is needed, to set both of them to the same value, and whatever value is needed based on the space that's there. And of course I can do this in a shortcut. I can just use margin. I'll say 0 for the top and bottom, or maybe 20 pixels for the top and bottom. And then that second value would be right and left, which I will set to auto. So same result. Only thing that's different is it added that 20 pixels at the top. So that's basically it. So again, that's just a run through of how to create a simple 2-column layout, sort of a standard layout where everything is contained in your sort of primary box or component. Within that, you've got your header, your navigation, coded as a list, your main content area that's, in this case, 2 columns, and then a footer. And again, in this example, I coded the menu as a horizontal menu using display inline for each list item. And then I got these 2 boxes to sit next to each other using float. So they're both floating left. When you use float, you have a couple things you need to remember. One is if the container box collapses, target it, set overflow to auto. That will allow it to set its height based on the actual content it's containing. And if you need something to have its float removed, basically, if you don't want it to float, if you need to basically, sort of disable floating at that point, you can target that element and set clear to both. And I think that's it. So let me know if you have any questions about this. I'm going to have links to both the starting file and this final one. The only difference is just one will have all of this CSS and one won't. Again, let me know if you have any questions, and I really hope all of this is starting to make sense. I know this is a lot harder remotely, but all this layout stuff is really what I think is the most important part of CSS. Obviously, all the text formatting stuff is important and cool, but this is what allows you to create a real official looking web page. Okay, that's it. Thanks.